What's going on, guys? I'm Tyler, and I'm here to let you know that Wendy is no perfect movie. No. So, Wendy, as you can imagine, is a reimagined version of Peter Pan that not only puts more emphasis on Wendy and her brothers as the main driving force of the story is mostly told from their perspective, but as opposed to early 1900s London, England, they live in 1950s, 60s, I don't know what era of the Deep South, and there are just so many weird changes that come with this adaptation, namely how Peter himself is not a magical entity, but the island is. And the island has a very odd way of how age works, where as long as you believe in hope and optimism, you can stay the exact same age as you came to this island forever. But when you start to lose hope, you start to age more rapidly, and those effects can't be reversed, and that's where Captain Hook comes into the play. That's my best way of summing up this plot, and I just finished watching the damn movie today. And, not gonna lie, my good buddy Josh warned me not to check this movie out because at the local art house theater that he works at, he and his co-workers, back when they were going to put it out into theaters, they had got a screener of it, they watched it, and, needless to say, they were not impressed at all. One of his bosses is actually named Wendy, which I think, made it a little bit harder on them, but I still wanted to check it out because deep down, I love Peter Pan. I love the 1953 version. The 2003 one, on its own, is actually pretty decent. Pan, it has its guilty pleasure moments, but they're guilty nonetheless. And I just, deep down, wanted to see what a modern take on the story would look like, how they could capture the themes of what it means to grow up in a darker fashion while still being able to have their own version of the whimsy that comes with the fantastical elements of Peter Pan, especially with the island of Neverland. But the fact of the matter is, I'm not even really interested in calling this a Peter Pan movie because it really doesn't feel like it. Yes, it's great that they tell the story more from Wendy and her brother's perspective more than Peter by a little bit, but at the end of the day, it's still a Peter Pan adaptation, and part of what makes Wendy so fascinating as a main character is her complicated friendship with Peter Pan, how his actions drastically change her idea of what it really means to grow up and whether or not that can be a bad thing. The actor who plays Peter, Yashua Mack, I believe is his name, he's not a bad actor, and technically he does fine with the material that he's given. It's just that Peter Pan in this movie is not an interesting character or even really a prominent character because there are barely that many scenes where Peter and Wendy are in the exact same location. Never mind the fact that Peter Pan is just Peter, which just makes him come across as more boring. Never mind the fact that we actually see a picture of him with a mother and some siblings that gives away part of his backstory that never comes into fruition throughout the rest of the movie. As soon as they mention it, it's completely forgotten. Never mind the fact that Peter Pan, a magical entity who can fly, minor spoilers, he can't fucking fly, he can't do any magic. Never mind just what a complete buzzkill that is, because in the trailer, there's just like, we're gonna be able to fly. Real fly? That is a fucking tease. That never fucking happens. Wow, as I said before, there are barely any scenes between Peter and Wendy actually bonding as friends, let alone contrasting their different philosophies about what it means to grow up and whether or not that's a bad thing. Because even when they do, their conversations are the most basic after-school special conversations with very basic, cheesy, and just really preachy dialogue that any person could have written. In fact, some of the dialogue does kind of sound like a 50s Disney adaptation. It's not so subtle, but hell, the Peter Pan one from the 50s was considerably more subtle without even really trying. It felt like such a wasted opportunity, and as bad as the connection between Peter and Wendy being non-existent anyways, I couldn't really even latch on to the Darling Brothers or any of the Lost Boys or even Captain Hook as a villain for a variety of different reasons. The Lost Boys, who are already on Neverland when Wendy and her brothers show up, they're the most basic wild children who scream at everything. They love to frolic and play around, and the only time they really get any highlights to do that are these Terrence Malick-style montages of them just relishing in the fact that they can be kids forever, things that I should really enjoy being on screen. I should have been breathtaking, I should have been smiling at all of these things, but I never got that because did they even have names, let alone have at least an implication of their past? There are these moments where Peter has a Polaroid of his family and he draws chalk drawings on this one cave. Wouldn't it be a great visual motif to have them draw their own charcoal drawings of what their family lives are like, how they're in denial of the fact that they do miss being a normal kid? This movie presents itself as a show don't tell movie. That would have been a great example of being a show don't tell scene. Never mind these ridiculous montages that really sidestep just what a joy it is to live as a kid forever. The brothers themselves, they do get more they have more development technically as time goes on, but I don't know, something that really bugged me about the brothers in particular, it's not that they're never fazed by these new surroundings that they've never seen before, but the editing and the scene transitions are so lazy, and scenes begin and end without any segue whatsoever, and it's really hard to explain. At one scene, they're discovering that their former next-door neighbor, who disappeared in the exact same fashion 9 years ago, hasn't aged whatsoever, something that Wendy has to point out since she's the one who watched him disappear, even though she wasn't even a year old. She was a baby. How could she even remember any of this stuff? Assuming that even was the implication. They discover their next-door neighbor has not aged for 9 years, and they're mildly freaked out. Only mildly, which I found really weird. But in the next scene, they're in a new location, and they have already accepted and embraced Peter and the Lost Boys' new way of life, with no explanation why they've accepted it, not even the slightest visual cue or implication as to why that might be. They try to present themselves as being a visually told movie based on how many scenes rely on long pauses between the kids' lines and their reactions to each other's varying beliefs on what it means to live in Neverland, and I give the director full credit for trying to do that. But scene transitions in this movie are so non-existent, and it really hurts the movie because in one scene where it's entirely about the atmosphere of kids playing with each other, relishing in the fact that they are going to be 9 or 10 years old for the rest of their life, allegedly, so long as they do follow the Neverland rules, because that is the great thing about Peter Pan. Even though in Neverland anything can happen, there still technically are rules because there are different factions of people that have different ways of life. Even though there are atmospheric scenes that are really just Terrence Malick montages of the kids playing around, which could be really well done and could be really fascinating, they go by so quickly that you never get to soak in the atmosphere that these kids are living in. So in the next scene, when they're all of a sudden sad and the scenes rely heavily on these shots of them just pondering what their feelings are, and we're supposed to guess what they're pondering based on their expressions, those scenes don't work because they have nothing to do with each other. On top of that, I just hated the way that they incorporated Captain Hook into the story. I won't go too specific in how the two of them became enemies, but not only do they show the actual backstory of how he lost his hand in such an unnecessarily grim fashion. Like, seriously, when they were about to show it, I just sat there, I'm like, please, cut away. And then they don't. Peter Pan, the joy of never growing up, and it's such a grim, bleak atmosphere. But the worst part about Captain Hook in this movie is that his motivation doesn't even really make sense. I won't spoil why, but at one point he actually is allies with Peter. Something really tragic happens to a friend of his that he blames Peter for, and then when the island's effects start to weigh on him, at one point he turns to Peter for help, and long story short, that help does not work out, and it results in him losing his hand to Peter, so all of a sudden he hates Peter for doing exactly what he asked Peter to do? I think there is so much about Wendy that makes zero damn sense whatsoever, and I have absolutely no idea if I can even convey what's wrong about this movie without spoiling it. I can't say it's a completely bad movie because there are a couple positives. The cinematography itself is very beautiful, except for some handheld shots that do a much better job at hiding actors or locations out of the frame as opposed to capturing them in the frame. But the scenery of Neverland itself is absolutely gorgeous. The wide shots that make the characters look like ants in comparison are absolutely stunning. Everything is seemingly so practical. There are a lot of stunts that are done with the characters underwater or near these volcanic areas of the island that they were filming the movie in, and they were so impressive that I was blown away by how they could actually get away with having these kids do these stunts in such dangerous locations. And as much as I think the character development is non-existent, Devin France as Wendy is technically doing a good job. Yashua Mack is technically doing a good job as Peter. All the actors are good. They're just given little to no depth to begin with, and it was such a huge letdown. I don't know what inspired them to make such a grounded, realistic version of Peter Pan while taking away the majority of the magical elements that make it such an entertaining story to begin with. You can make the argument that it's just like, oh, well, we're focusing on the human drama that comes with this story. Okay, fine. But the human drama is interesting to begin with because there are so many great, imaginative, fantastical elements that come with the story that give it a sense of wonder that offset the dramatic themes that come with the story. It seems like they're trying to do one over the other, and in my opinion, this isn't the story that you can really do that. And you can say that they didn't have the budget to do stuff like flying or even have a Tinkerbell type of character because there's a Tinkerbell character for one scene and it's just to row a boat, and then I don't think we ever even see her again, even when the kids, long story short, get into danger with Captain Hook. If you didn't have the budget to do the more fantastical elements, I hate to say it, but don't make the movie then. There's no easy way to say it. There's no nice way of saying it, that's for sure. I don't really know if I can say much else about Wendy other than it was a huge letdown. There were way too many changes to the source material. The really talented kid actors in this movie have little to nothing to work with. There is some beautiful scenery, but it really doesn't amount to much. So for all those reasons, I have no idea how helpful my thoughts were to you guys, but I'm going to give Wendy a 1.5 out of 5. Guys, thanks as always for watching. Again, I'm not entirely sure how much my thoughts have summed up the movie all that much, but if you have seen Wendy, if you have differing opinions, because there are a great amount of people that actually like this movie, and I can kind of understand why, let me know in the comments below what you thought about it. Be sure to stay tuned for more reviews, and be sure to like and subscribe. Take care.